Bonjour, hello, and aloha, folks. I'm Layman Pascal, and my guest today is a nuanced thinker and process theologian recommended to me by Oliver Griebel, for whom I wrote a chapter on God in the English version of his Many One anthology. I'm especially excited for this talk because anybody who's written a paper called Ambiguities in Panentheism is probably my kind of guy. So I'm very happy that he's here. And like a couple of zookeepers trying to get pandas to mate, we're going to put theos and ology in a cage together and see if we can entice them to get a little closer. Hi, Andrew.
Layman, good to have you. Thanks for the invite.
Is there a Whitehead renaissance going on? Do you get the sense that people are starting to feel like the cosmology he lays out is viscerally pertinent to the kind of world that's emerging from our science and tech and cultural sentiment today?
Excellent question. I think it's really interesting how Whitehead's universe has been received and is being received. I, of course, have a perspective from the States, and Whitehead traditionally has been seen alongside American pragmatism, American philosophy. So certainly when it comes to American philosophizing cosmology and philosophy, Whitehead has been a part of the conversation for some time. That's partly a result of him moving to Harvard and beginning to teach philosophy, taking the chair in philosophy at the age of 63. That's when he began his deep metaphysical episode, which is, I think, interesting in itself. But of course, Whitehead's thought has been taken over by, or at least the intuitions of his thought taken by a number of thinkers. Hartshorne, I think, helped popularize process theology in the States. But certainly when it comes to his cosmological thinking, his roots go back to the UK and to the London, Cambridge, Oxford region, where today, although his thought is growing, it's still quite a bit, what's the right word? It's less known, and I think there's less interest. I think that's a sort of interesting fact, right? No prophet is sort of known in his own home type of thing. So dialogues are happening between process thinkers in the States and process thinkers abroad, and we're trying to bridge the gaps as to where that disconnect of interest is. I will say that a few years ago, David Griffin made some call it a prophetic statement that this would be the Whiteheadian century. I think there's a number of reasons for that. There's certainly ecological reasons when it comes to the need to rethink our metaphysical and philosophical foundations in light of a rather precarious ecological future. There's the questions of the sciences. Certainly, Whitehead's philosophy was not just one of complete speculation, but wanted to ground and harmonize the new insights of the sciences. And this was in the world of physics, of psychology, developmental biology, certainly the Maxwell field theories surrounding electromagnetism. In Whitehead's time, you saw these various sciences converging towards a new understanding of the world. And he thought essentially that philosophy had to follow in step. Philosophy had to do its service in grounding and harmonizing the presuppositions of the sciences. So I think we're in a very unique time. And Whitehead is, I think, only growing in interest, but not just Whitehead. There's other integral style philosophies that are becoming ever more relevant to our time and to the different advances of the sciences and the different social and ecological complications of things, which we're beginning to see more than ever, I would say.
It seems like there are a lot of people who don't know Whitehead, and that there's a lot of people who know Whitehead and find it very dense and difficult to get into. But there might also be some kind of felt resistance to the emphasis on time and process and flux and transformation that people experience. I wonder if you feel like you've seen that, and also if you feel like that might be slowly changing, that people are becoming more available to that kind of mobile, transformative universe.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my experience, I haven't seen much pushback to this deep temporality. And I think in part, if folks are combatant against that style of thinking, or the notion that becoming is more fundamental than being, this deep processual element, it tends to be because they've already alleged themselves to a certain style of thinking philosophically. They may not know that. Right. Whitehead has an interesting statement where he says we should not trust what the eye sees in terms of static objects or entities, and then project that downward as if that is what is fundamental. So I think what's so essential for Whitehead, for other radical empiricist thinkers, is attention to human experience. And the reason for that is because we're not a great exception to everything that's going on. You didn't fall into the world from nowhere. If that was the case, it'd be hard to see how that helps or how we could begin to speak about anything. But rather, we express nature at its most fundamental level in terms of the principles, the metaphysical style principles that are embodied in nature. And what those principles give us, Whitehead thinks, is a completely fluid universe where past is moving into the present is anticipating the future, and you cannot step in the same river twice, as great Heraclitus said. For Whitehead, for James as well, you can't have the same moment twice. So I think those who are not pushing back are beginning to see that their experience of the world is completely fluid in a deep and really profound sense. So I realized, just to say a personal note, when I came into thinking about the claim that creativity or becoming is more fundamental than being, what got me there was not just observations. It was internal introspection. And I think Whitehead, there's a beautiful sense of meditation. He says his book, Process and Reality, difficult as it is, was a result of years of meditation. And I think that's an important point. So I think there's some pushback when it comes to substance style philosophy and the prevalence that thinking has had in the West, but there's always been, all the way back to the pre-Socratic thinkers, a lineage of process style thinking that's there. And I think the word Renaissance is appropriate. I think it's coming to the fore in a deep way.
There's something interesting in that for me, because I feel like there's a plausible argument that the way we experience the world, and maybe even the way we think about it, isn't arbitrary, that it tells us something about the deep structures of the world, and we can read our experience back in as part of the data. But we also know that the way we experience and perceive and interpret the basic options available to our cognition are deeply colored by social incentives and evolutionary biases and shifting metaphors that emerge with dominant media paradigms, and maybe even a covert inclination to be deceived about ourselves. So if we think it's valid to treat our experience as an indicator of the nature of reality, how do we make sure that it is our experience and not just what we think about our experience as an extension of dominant habits of social ideation and power structures and our habits of articulation and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and one that's, I would think there's no simple answer to it, right? So I think we have to be vigilant and on guard that our experience is not simply what we're projecting onto it, if we can put it that way, but our experience is dealing with what for Whitehead would be those presuppositions, these ultimate presuppositions that we encounter in daily life. One critique Whitehead and other process thinkers put against the modern tradition of philosophy is that it trusts in abstractions. We abstract from our more fluid experience to there's obviously a helpful method in doing that. We're able to grasp things when we abstract them from their context. But when we trust those abstractions and disregard our experience, he calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So the idea of a vacuous bit of matter that is internally devoid of experience and dead, for Whitehead, is just a frozen abstraction from human experience rather than the living, breathing experiential element. So I'd say there's something beautiful in Whitehead's thinking where we should not theoretically deny what we inevitably assume in our practice. Freedom would be a part of that. The stubborn sense of value would be a part of that. The movement of time, right? These are all part of the metaphysical dimensions where, although we can misunderstand them, I don't think for him he'd say they could ultimately be reduced. But I think your question's a good one, and we should be on guard against that always.
To what degree are notions like flux and becoming also examples of abstract, misplaced concreteness?
Yeah, so I think again, it's this challenging question of within the tradition of metaphysics, of which we have to deal with both flux and process, as well as permanence and stasis, if you want. Clearly, our experience bears witness to these things. In process thinkers, it's wrong to think that they're only insisting upon process only and always, right? Because there are mountains and there are rivers. We have to make sense of both of them. So, but the question is, I think, which one is more fundamental? So process thinkers, Whitehead in particular, has a way of making sense of permanence, but it's more persistence through process. Process thinkers are still going to hold on to this deeply fluid dimension of reality. And it's interesting to think about whether process or movement or change is itself an abstraction. An abstraction from what? I think it could only be an abstraction from something that itself would be deeply processual and not just ultimately static. So that's a challenge, I think.
Yes.
As we mull it over here.
You can't help get some kind of recursive loop there if you push it down further.
I know. I'm trying to work myself out of that.
Okay, maybe you're the right kind of guy to help me out with a problem I've been having, which is a split in myself about the use of the concept of God as an alternative to the world. Because part of me thinks that conceiving of the divine as even the creator of the world, or as above or beyond or outside of reality, is a sneaky way of saying the divine is actually unreal and lacks the status of existence. So I would worry about subconscious nihilistic results from conflating ultimate value with non-existence. But another part of me worries, and I'm using the term worry loosely, that identifying the divine as the immanent totality, as the everythingness shared by all the real processes and not separate from them, like loses a possibility of human maturational potency that comes from having to confront something that's utterly other and provides an experiential pathos of vivid contrast to our tidy concept of reality. So
beautifully
what's to do about that, Andrew?
Run for the hills. No. Well, I think you put it beautifully, and I see the tension there. You're drawing attention, and this sort of moves us into thinking more panentheistically, perhaps, which is a concept I like and I've tried to complicate and whatnot. But yeah, it is an issue, of course. Now, I think to speak again from my perspective, and I'm writing I should mention, I'm writing a short, not so short, introduction to Whitehead's thought currently, and I'm trying to fulfill his vision for a more introductory audience. I'm on this portion right now, so it's sort of a nice question. You may know that Whitehead makes a great claim where he says, in the first place, God is not to be seen as an exception to all metaphysical principles invoked to save their collapse. God is their chief exemplification. And there's been a lot written about that, but in part what that means is that God, at least in principle, is approachable, right? If that weren't the case, and I think theological commitments, it's interesting, have to be largely made about that issue. Either it seems there's only two basic options. Either God embodies and expresses the ultimate depths of reality within God's life, or God does not, and God is the great exception to them. And if the latter is true, it's hard to say anything about God. God is wholly other. God is ultimately transcendent. And I'm not sure why that would matter or how that would help in a sort of explanatory question. Conversely, if God does chiefly express these ultimate depths of reality, then God is sharing these depths of reality with the world. So there's an immediate sense of intimacy associated with the God-world relationship. But for Whitehead, it's not one where God retains independence. So the relationship between God and the world is what I like to call independent inseparability. And that's, I think, important because neither the world nor God are conflated into one another. If they were, something deeply valuable is lost in terms of relationship. So transcendent theism has a tendency to view God and the world dualistically. Not always, but in principle, God doesn't need the world. Right, so there's a breach in relationship that's a part of that scenario. Similarly, the opposite, essentially a diffuse pantheism where God and the world are conflated into one another, also loses that element of relationship that I think for Whitehead, for process thinkers, we want to preserve that as being a situation of ultimate value and collaboration. So that might help us get into thinking about panentheism. Sometimes process thinkers do not use that language for Whitehead. On the whole, they have, but the chair of my work, Roland Faber, has used the language of trans-pantheism because he's wanted to preserve this independent inseparability. It's not just the case that the world is within God or God is the environment for the world. It's also reciprocally the case that the world is God's environment too. Does that help? Or, I mean, does that approach answering your worry and your problem? Let's think about that maybe.
I mean, it affords me the opportunity to shift into my non-dualistic mode.
Well, and let me say too, is that relationship of independent inseparability is what Whitehead calls mutual immanence. And the language, the relationship of mutual immanence really is a non-dual vision of God in the world, and not just God in the world.
Does it imply, a medium that permits that or interfaces between them? Or is the only thing like a medium just the fact of the ultimate paradox of their independent non-separability?
Nice. Yeah, is there a medium? Well, it's interesting, and this is also controversial for more, I think, classically theistic thinkers, is God is usually seen to be as the ultimate reality, being itself, or the ground of being. Whitehead, in fact, is not making that claim. In fact, for him, because he is so convinced that becoming is more fundamental than being, the ultimate reality is creativity. That's the language he uses. Creativity is what makes it true that becoming is more fundamental than being. It's this creative urge, the many become one and are increased by one. It's this utter connected urge forward. And this doesn't mean that God is somehow lower than ultimate reality, because for Whitehead, there is ultimate reality and then there's ultimate actuality, and you need both, and they mutually implicate each other. So God, if we're to speak of a medium, the medium is creativity, and God, the world embodies creativity in ways that are relevant to its finitude, and God also embodies creativity chiefly, is ultimately creative within the divine life on behalf of the world. So the medium, it would be creativity. So, but we're already getting into thinking about questions of what is ultimate. So we've mentioned already that God is ultimate, for Whitehead, ultimate actuality. The world in a finite, fleeting, becoming way is ultimate, but it's ultimate actuality in terms of finitude. There's also creativity, which is formless for Whitehead. It's only actual when it's embodied. And then the last I would bring in is the element of possibility, infinite, eternal possibility, what Whitehead just calls eternal objects. So all of these, none can be torn from each other. They're all independent but inseparable. They're all mutually immanent. And so you can coherently see the world as one, or you can see it as many. You know, and it just depends, but it's like a spinning sort of prism. In fact, Whitehead's wife says that his thinking is like a prism, and you must see it spinning with all of its lights and colors. And if you've only seen one side, you haven't seen it, right? It's a half truth. So very compelling sorts of things. But again, we're on the edge of thinking about the presuppositions of a fluid world.
This notion that there's some self-consistency between the characteristics of God and the world seems like it could be viewed from two different angles, where on one side, God is the maximal exemplar of the characteristics of the world and ourselves. But on the other hand, the characteristics of processes like ourselves and the world might depend upon them already being afforded by the nature of God. Is there a way to adjudicate between those, or are those a way of saying the same thing?
That's a really great question. And you follow up on the prism idea, right? So you're saying from one side and from the other side, but it's spinning. So they are different sides of a mutually implicating sort of philosophical scenario. Well, I think one way you might think about it is in terms of what the world and what God give each other reciprocally. So, excuse me, in Whitehead's vision, what is gifted to the world is the gift of its own self-creation, the gift of possibility, the gift of the possibility of not repeating the past and of doing something new. So God's action with the world, the modus operandi of God, is a persuasive offering of what can be, of possibility. The world's responsibility, the world's purpose, is to take what can be in the mode of possibility and bring it into being creatively. Once that happens, right, God then has something to incorporate that's actually achieved, right? Merely possible things are different from actual things. And the idea is God offers possibility, the world actualizes it. God incorporates what has been done and offers the world back a new vision for itself. So both sides that you're talking about are reciprocally happening at the same sort of time, and each moment, even as Whitehead understands it. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. What does Whitehead have to say about a more optimal human relationship to what he's thinking of as God? And is there any sense in which being a member of a religious tradition or even believing in God makes any difference to optimizing that relationship?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Of course, Whitehead had like most of us, had a rather complicated relationship with theology, with religion, and for a number of years gave it up completely, sold his theological library. So he was either an agnostic or an atheist for at least 20 years. But he didn't stay that way. And I think that's interesting. And again, I'm just writing about this now, and people speculate as to why that is. But Whitehead didn't introduce the notion of God because of any big religious agenda. He had his critiques of theology and religion, but he also had a vision for what they could be. He has, I would say, in modern philosophy, some of the most beautiful statements, passages about religion. He wrote where is it? He wrote an excellent book called Religion in the Making. Perhaps you're familiar with it. I'd recommend it to everybody. It's a slim book, but really quite powerful. And so I think postulating God or believing in God for him has a philosophical and a rational base first. I think that's important. And he follows Aristotle in part in that, right? He admires his dispassionate sort of postulation of the unmoved mover because of his system and what was required in staying true to his philosophical principles, right? There's an element of the Socratic element of following the argument, following the truth to its logical sort of ends. And he finds a similar need rationally and in terms of explanatory mode for the place of God. And so some have wanted to say that Whitehead's God is not religiously available at all. They've argued that. But it's quite clear to me that if you read Whitehead closely, there's a deep religious availability to his God. God is not just this unchanging primordial aspect, this primordial nature, but also consequent and deeply related to the world. And the language Whitehead uses in speaking about God's relationship to the world is religious language: patience, tender care, love, companionship. This is all religious kind of language. So I think the philosophical God of the philosophers and God of religion is there. And in Religion in the Making, he even has one beautiful vision where he says, he speaks about an ultimate rightness in the nature of things and the ability of religious minds and religious thinkers to intuit a character to the nature of things, as if you were intuiting the character of a friend. It's not obvious that it's some, God cares in a sense, not in this overly personal, parental kind of way, it would seem, but in a way that's appropriate to all of the existential and religious longing that has been produced in us as a part and parcel of this universe. So I want to defend Whitehead in terms of religion. He's a critic. He's one of the best critics of religion. I would put him next to some of the masters of suspicion in a deep way, but he didn't hold on to their ultimately atheistic or nihilistic conclusions. And I think that's important to emphasize.
There's an interesting tension in there between rational argumentation and the intuiting, right?
Yeah.
Has anyone ever been persuaded by a rational argument for the existence of God, or is the formulation of such arguments just a way of sharpening our intuitions?
That's a great way to put it. But Whitehead certainly wasn't convinced by proofs. In fact, he'll say there's nothing in the nature of proof here. But he is, I think, following his intuitive search to where he thinks it ultimately ends. And so I think you're right. You point to a good sort of tension there. I think there's a role for arguments of God. I think they're interesting, but they're not in the end, I think, so conclusive for folks that, that's the deciding factor. So I think the deciding factor, again, has to be experiential. And if anything, these proofs or these arguments, I think, have to be consistent with that experience. So if you think of other process thinkers like in the more rational camp, Hartshorne and David Griffin, they've gone to great lengths to rethink traditional arguments on different philosophical principles to argue for a different kind of God. And they argue that these are worthwhile. And ultimately, I don't know if they'd use the language of proof, but they'd say they're ultimately correct in some way. One book I'd recommend to you, great title, God Exists, but God, G-A-W-D, does not. And this is Griffin's book of a few years ago, where he's utilizing different dimensions of arguments for God's existence to argue for a different kind of God. And of course, there's not just one understanding of God. That's important, So if one God dies, God is dead. That doesn't mean that atheism is the next best conclusion. It means that perhaps we need to reassess our understanding of things.
How do we know in a conversation whether we mean the same thing by God, or whether we're not just being deluded by the apparent self-consistency of the signifier into discussing wildly different referents without realizing it?
Yeah, that's I think the best we can do is lay out certain kinds of definitions and try to be as clear and concise as we can. But it is an eminently problematic word. Now, I think it's interesting. Whitehead lost followers Carnap stopped following him when he brought in the language of God to his philosophy. And I got to think that that's partly because of the problematic term. People have so many assumptions surrounding it. Of course, if you stay with Whitehead, you'll begin to see what he means by that term. But it's interesting to see that as his work developed after Process and Reality into Adventures of Ideas, this great book on civilization, the language of God started to get muted. He started to drop that language and instead use different language, the eros of the universe, the adventure of the universe as one. And his two great essays in his concluding, his final essays, Immortality, Mathematics and the Good, the language of God just doesn't appear. The function and the reality of God is there, but the language is not used. And so you raise a good question, whether or not we can use this term. Karl Rahner argued that this term is what makes us human, and we cannot help but use it. But as to what it means, I think there's no simple way for me to see that you and I are connecting on precisely the same notion, unless we do our best to lay that out. I mean, don't you think so? I mean, it's a hard struggle, I think.
Yeah, I think our best bet is probably that we could clarify a small set of highly repeating uses of the word, and possibly like show me on the doll what you mean by God, like
right.
what you're talking about. But in general, there's something inherently ambiguous about it. Like it might even be structured as an inherently ambiguous signifier that we're just always putting things into and taking things out of.
Yeah, but I think the point would be, I agree with you there. I think Whitehead again is saying if God is a part of the metaphysical situation, which you have to really say God is, because God exists. If God exists, then God's part of the metaphysical situation. That gives you a place to start. So you're not just beginning with complete and utter speculations with respect to that term. Again, he's pointing to our experience and what we can imaginatively extend from our experience all the way down and all the way up, presumably in nature, because it goes both ways. But the ambiguity is certainly there. And this is an imaginative exercise for Whitehead. Metaphysics is imaginative. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And perhaps I do throw that term around too quickly, but many of us do. You know?
I find in a lot of advanced thought circles that God sometimes gets what seems to me to be reduced to everything and or emptiness approached through a valid second person lens, that God is like infinity when you talk to it. But what that misses is the will of God. It misses a directional urge and reward dynamic that's very essential in most religious traditions and also in a lot of private religious epiphanies.
Yeah.
So for myself, I tend to imagine that the underlying syntax of deep ontology sets up the form that integrative emergence takes when a surplus of coherence is elicited from reality in some kind of divergent, convergent intensity, and that this pattern is holographically distributed and the momenta of the universe to re-inform itself as it goes forward, and that this has a sort of qualitative, it describes a set of patterning styles that repeat in that process with a certain quality. And that for me, that could be a reasonable, not classically metaphysical sense of a telos of the universe, that the trends are all trying to get to that qualitative outcome, even though the form of that outcome isn't fixed. So that's my nonsense.
Well, I don't think it's
as a telos or a will or having a directional implication.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I like the language you're using of the qualitative dimension to the universe. And of course, there really is that dimension. I'm unwilling to sort of just reduce that out of existence. The universe is not just quantitative. As a side note, perhaps you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work. I'm reading and just finished the second volume of his monumental book, The Matter of Things. And again, his whole vision is the way in which the modern world has become too slavishly tied to the methods of the left hemisphere and its quantitative, reductive ways of dealing with the world. And so the right hemisphere, this element that brings in the qualitative, the gestalt, the holistic, has to be a part of the conversation. I think it's so pertinent within our experience that it has to find a place in a metaphysical scenario as well. So when it comes to God, God is not just some vacuous, aimless, in principle reality. Whitehead has a beautiful statement where he says the purpose of God is the attainment of value in the temporal world. So I mentioned earlier that God offers the world possibilities of being. One of the interesting problems, I think, of philosophy is that it seems to be that possibilities have a certain value character associated with them. And if we think about our own experience for a moment, we do this all the time. What we're going to eat for lunch, trivial possibility. Whether we're going to have kids, a not so trivial possibility. But possibilities ahead of us and behind us, right? We would lament the possibilities behind us that could have been different but weren't. Whitehead lost his son Eric in World War I, and he laments this. Could have been different. But we anticipate a future of openness that is not neutral. It has a certain value character. And so possibility and value are wedded together. And Whitehead envisions God as being the presupposition of not only the fact of the problem surrounding the existence of possibility, but the problem of there being real standards of value in the universe. So when God offers, in principle, possibilities to the universe, they're possibilities with an aim attached to them. But because it comes to every event in the universe, there are contextualized values and contextualized possibility, what can be achieved in that moment given context. So the telos is there. It's not one that has an absolute determined purpose for any one moment or for any one universe, no dead set eschaton, because God is really in relationship with an unfolding world where the future is an open array of possibilities. God knows those possibilities, and God offers relevant possibilities, but God can't know in principle what the world will actualize or what it will choose. So teleology, of course, is also a bad word in addition to God, depending on who you're talking to. Process thinkers, I think, have a way of thinking about teleology that is that avoids some of the negative implications that are assumed. But even secular folks in biophilosophy are speaking of teleology again. I mean, there's purpose in nature, and if we're willing to deny that, we're willing to deny an element of our experience that is very fundamental. So anyhow, what do you think about that? I mean,
I think it's not possible for us to think apart from value.
Yeah.
The qualitative is built in, and we only pretend it isn't.
Yeah.
But it has these different forms. Like, I guess one of the things that's coming up for me right now is the notion of goodness, right? So and what's a non-naive, let's say post-Nietzschean, valid understanding of goodness and how we would optimize our relationship to it as a potentiality going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, post-Nietzschean, are we the Übermensch? I mean, can we really create values that otherwise are not there in the nature of things? So I think this is where, if one is to talk about value realism or objective values, then they are what they are, independent of our subjective strivings. Now, of course, there's a sense in which culturally, societally, we do create certain domains of value. And cultures are going to disagree about what is good or what is evil, but that there's a difference between them, is rarely, I think, argued, right? There's some distinction here in terms of better and worse. And this distinction, and even speaking about that, we're already in the domain of value. Well, better or worse for whom? We all have different conflicting better and worse scenarios. So I think there's arguments that can be made for better and worse being woven into the nature of things, value being what philosophers like to call an ontological primitive. And I've written quite a bit about that in my book, Mind, Value, and the Cosmos, where I put Whitehead and a few other thinkers together. So I really love the value question. You mentioned goodness, though. For Whitehead, beauty is the most fundamental value. So aesthetic value is the widest and most inclusive form of value that's applicable to the universe, a value and aesthetic intensity, aesthetic harmony. So I think goodness is a value that ethically emerges from a more fundamental domain of aesthetic value. As a great statement where he says, essentially, moral action is merely certain actualizations of aesthetic value realized in human life. So I think there's a relationship between those, but we wouldn't say that a lion and a gazelle are committing perhaps moral acts of evil. But there is a certain aesthetic intensity involved. But that doesn't mean things can't be tragic. The aesthetic can be tragic as well. Auschwitz was utterly tragic, but it was aesthetically intense in terms of cooperation, in terms of the harmony of destructive systems, etc. There's an element of evil here. Whitehead calls it tragic beauty. The universe begins with a dream and then reaps tragic beauty. That's the language he uses. So, I mean, what do you think about the aesthetic dimension, that language of beauty as well, in addition to simply the good? And this gets us back to God, but maybe we'll go there for a moment.
I'm a little bit uncertain. I feel like I could imagine scenarios where any of the sort of major Socratic values was used as the one that you reduce the other ones to.
Sure.
You might be able to tell a story where aesthetics is a subdivision of goodness. I certainly, one of the things, if you have a child, you want their body arranged in a certain way. You don't want to come home and find their heads on the lawn and their limbs are in the backyard. That's a moral aesthetic problem. That's not configured.
Yeah, that's bad art. Yeah.
But in terms of eliciting from us some sort of directionality in our own practice, an obligation, how do we good? It's not immediately clear how the aesthetic approach tells us what to do in order to be morally better beings.
Yes. Well, you're right. I mean, I'm not sure we're ever going to be told what to do, but there is something about a beautiful life, right? And I think people recognize more or less intense forms of beauty. There's a reason we look up to our religious leaders, Gandhi and King and Jesus, the Buddha, etc. Fill in the blank, as realizing something in human life that is not just good, but also beautiful, in a way that we cannot say of, say, Hitler and Pol Pot and others. So I do think beauty can be directional, and the almost spiritual task of beautifying each moment is I would say a moral task too. So again, we're playing with these difficult distinctions between beauty and goodness. And again, for Whitehead to back up again to what is offered to the world from this divine level, as it were, which is also a worldly level, values of truth, beauty, and goodness. So God is the poet of the world, leading it by his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness is one of Whitehead's most famous statements. Poetic interaction is that interaction between God and the world that has to do with persuasiveness of values. And so these categories of truth, beauty, and goodness are not simply imposed on the world, right? But presupposed. And we have to navigate them. That's complex on a societal and a cultural level. I fully admit that. I won't combat that.
If I remember correctly, because I read this years ago, that Whitehead has a sort of cluster of basic principles that might define beauty, especially as it pertains to a work of art. Something about the proportionality of diversity to unification, what's novel and what's recognizable, and things like that. So, I mean, if I'm remembering that correctly, could you speak to what those principles are and in what way they might be able to suggest to us, how to try to make a more beautiful life and a more beautiful world?
Yeah, I'm not sure which principles per se you're speaking of, but the language, I mean, there's a chapter in the end of Adventures of Ideas where several chapters, in fact, he concludes the book looking at what he thinks are the essential ideals for civilization. Truth, beauty, goodness, zest, adventure, these are all ideals for him. And of course, all wrapped up in mutually implicating one another, but beauty in part, he speaks of it as a harmony of contrasts. So there's again, this is sort of independent inseparability thing. The language of harmony is a vision for how potentially conflicting or contrasting things can be together. Like togetherness is the language he uses quite a bit, in such a way that beauty emerges. Now, I mean, I think of trying to apply it to society, to the universe. The universe is a remarkable expression of harmony and contrast. I think that's a part of why we say it's beautiful. It works in a deeply harmonious sort of fashion. Of course, I wouldn't want to stress that. There's also, exploding supernova and black holes, and there's an element of beauty there too. Applying it societally, I don't know how to. I see what it means to say that we are utterly diverse individuals in many different ways, that there's an element of harmony or tuning to human life that could produce beauty, but I'm not sure. I don't know how to necessarily get there without saying that I have to start with myself. I have to, you can tune a guitar, to a harmony that's beautiful. I think in principle, human lives can be tuned as well towards the realization of values, but tuning all of them. This is the societal and the moral task, and there's no coercion involved. I can't coerce you to tune yourself to play a nice tune. You have to do that yourself. So I struggle with that. It's the individual and the collective struggle. But Whitehead wrestled with that as well, and and he points to civilizations essentially not being murdered but committing suicide. And that's interesting too. What would it mean for a society to commit suicide with respect to its ideals? And he warns us from becoming decadent and falling asleep. And I think, given the last couple of years, like that is very much hits home, because I think we're in a place of societal decline. It almost seems obvious in so many levels. What do you think about that?
Three things came up for me there around this theme of the harmony of contrasts. And one is that, like embodied contemplation of things that are aesthetic in the variety of senses, including goodness, might teach us to be better at navigating towards that balance of outcomes. Another one is that a lot of what's going on in the world now seems like a desecration of the evolved harmony of contrast we find in the ecosystem, and that's problematic. And then the third one was flow states, because that getting the right balance between harmony and contrast sounds similar to getting the right balance between challenge and capacity, and that the kind of personal learning that develops out of flow states seems to be really a key part of living a more beautiful life.
Yeah, I think it's really well put. Flow state is a great example of that. And I think what you're pointing to, and what I should have mentioned, is this element of practice. I think one thing we've learned is we can become more compassionate, we can become more beautiful people, but this doesn't happen with the snap of fingers. So again, one of the challenges for my personal life, perhaps yours as well, theoretically we can see it. We're playing with these concepts, but to actually realize it requires a kind of discipline, a spiritual discipline. There's flow states involved in meditation, and rock climbing, and all sorts of endeavors. These are modes of seeing or losing yourself into something more beautiful. So the element of practice has to be there, and I think would you say we're seeing more of that? I think contemplative meditation, contemplative contemplation in different ways have been a part of the traditions for so long. Are we rediscovering that? I think also of the realm of psychedelic renaissance that is happening. That language is being used. My colleagues at University of Exeter have been doing great work in that with recent conferences on philosophy of psychedelics. But there's different methods and instruments that the world offers, that the tradition offers, where we can begin to embody these forms of beauty. Now I just have to do it, you see.
Well, I think there is something like a renaissance of practice going on, although it's not because there's so many more people in the world. You could have a lot more practice and it could still be a smaller percentage than before. Nonetheless, it does seem like, the information universe allows us to be in collision between each other's idea systems, and that allows a slight devaluation of idea systems and a reciprocal interest in actually doing things and practicing. And we certainly see from the sciences, particularly, I think, health sciences and the neurobiology and the information we're getting from new neuro and biofeedback devices, the effects of different kinds of practice and different kinds of lifestyles. And they seem to dovetail very nicely with a lot of the ancient wisdom traditions. So it would be hard to imagine that not increasing going forward.
And I think there's something beautiful in that. There's a certain pomposity and cockiness associated with the modern world and its technology, et cetera, and I hate to see the denigration or, in a part, disrespect for the wisdom of the ancients. And I think we are in an interesting time where, again, I think the language of Renaissance is helpful here, where rediscovering those practices is literally what is going to get us out of suicidal tendencies. To name the band, I think there's a band. Suicidal tendencies, but again, a rediscovery of our roots is what's going to preserve us moving forward. And when it comes to our relationship to the earth, the ecological question, the environmental catastrophe, arguably, I think that's essential. We need to find a way of living and being in harmony. There's that language again, with nature as a part of nature. But there's so much dysfunction, wrapped up into all of this as well, that it becomes sort of bleak. But I tend to be an optimist cosmologically as well, and so not naively so, but I do believe in the goodness and the beauty of things, and that they're worth fighting for, lives are worth transforming on behalf of the larger whole of things. But I struggle with that.
I think it's worth it. I think that belief in that struggle creates a richer life. As for optimism, I think it's easier in the long run. Like, I'm more optimistic about the next 300 years than about the next 30.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
There was something popped into my mind a few minutes ago. We mentioned Nietzsche lightly, and I have, when I think of how he writes Thus Spake Zarathustra, I sort of imagine almost like a Hindu scenario where this subtle realm guru or phantasmatic reflection of the higher self shows up to give a teaching to this person, and ends up being what I would think of as maybe the first post-metaphysical spiritual protagonist in Western philosophical literature. But Alexander Bard, I don't know if you know him, he's a significant process thinker in some ways. He periodically reminds me that a pragmatic transcendental Zoroastrian wisdom is still a thing and has real untapped depths. And I'm curious what it is that you hear or feel that makes you interested in the religious ideas of Persian antiquity.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Yeah, I met Alexander Bard about a year ago at a conference. We've been in some dialogue and read each other's books. Fascinating guy. Syntheism, right, is his book that I really enjoyed. It reads sort of like definitely a manifesto of sorts, right? I can sort of characterize that in different ways, but fascinating work. I was fascinated to see this element of Zoroastrian thought being renewed in terms of current scenarios. I thought it was fascinating. I don't know how much I can speak to how that's informed my thinking, but certainly Zoroastrian thought tends to be pointed to as being this enormous well that we are still drinking from when it comes to thinking about a lot of the religious concepts that we still navigate today. He even goes so far as to say Zoroastrian thinking was the first sort of process philosophy, first process thinking. And that's an interesting connection that I have with it. So I don't know how much I can add to that, but I would like to, I'll say, explore that further, the Persian dimension, because that's essential and maybe overlooked, right? Even beyond our obsession with Greek thought, there is potentially further these deep well of Persian wisdom. So fair enough.
Which sort of ancient wisdom cultures do you personally resonate with the most? When you think of the esoteric wisdom of the ancients, who do you feel most intrigued by or connected to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think retrospectively, my discovery graduate school of process style thinking helped me understand and appreciate dimensions of Buddhist thought. Of course, arguably, they're one of the most ancient styles of process thinking, process metaphysics. So I think different Buddhist thinkers, certainly, I think in the modern world, Nishitani and some of the Kyoto school, which I'm dipping in and out of. I want to investigate quite a bit more, but there's a Buddhist strain, I think, that's really important. There's something deeply right in that. But I could equally say that this dimension of Atman being Brahman in the Hindu side is deeply compelling, of knowing thyself. And there's an element that connects us back to our beginning conversation here. We said that we're an expression and not an exception to things as well. And that there's an element, and if that's the case, then going internal, you meet the depth of ultimate reality, right? You meet the depth of the divine, if you want. So I think I'm formed by various dimensions of these traditions. I'm formed certainly by my own sort of Protestant Christian upbringing, which has been a complicated relationship, but I still adhere to much of the truth and beauty of that tradition as being valued and worthy of committing oneself. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, some of the mystics of the Christian tradition, Nicholas of Cusa when it comes to thinking in the medieval time, and Eckhart, certainly I'm exploring these thinkers, but of course they're speaking from deeper antecedents as well. So in part, those are a few.
Is theology a subset of philosophy, or is philosophy a subset of theology?
Nice. I think they are, they mutually, again, I'm going to use the language of they're mutually immanent. I think they mutually implicate each other. If you want, they're on an XY sort of axis, you know. And in some of my teaching and discussion with students, one metaphor we use is, you know, philosophy essentially being the horizontal axis of human inquiry, asking about what there is, how much, how many, what relationship, what character, and theology, the vertical axis of human inquiry. Of course, you could flip those around if you want to, because the questions that philosophy asks are eminently relevant to any claims of theology, and vice versa, arguably. So I wouldn't want to separate them from one another too deeply, but nor would I want to conflate them. Like the God-world relationship, they're mutually immanent as well. So, from my perspective.
Okay, well, here's another terminology question, which is,
Okay.
What is religion? When you say religion, what are you thinking of?
Oh man, yeah. I've always been advised not to offer a definition of religion. What is religion? Religion, let me quote from Whitehead. Religion is both what the individual does with his or her solitariness, as well as world loyalty. Right? There's much we sort of add to that, but I think religion is the attempt to live in harmony with that which we think is ultimately worthy of our allegiance. Live in harmony with the nature of things as we conceive it. It's an extremely broad definition, but you can add to that all sorts of religious scaffolding, ideas, doctrines, creeds to live by, but those can't just be what religion is, right? So there's another statement Whitehead offers where he says the learned orthodoxy suppresses adventure. You know, the dogmas and creeds are not necessarily what religion is. They speak to the deeper well of religious experience. So I think religions are modes of capturing and honoring traditions of experience. But I'm not sure I'm totally satisfied with that too, because I think religion is such a complex thing. And the last thing I'd want to do is reduce it to one single definition or one mode of expression. I mean, what do you think? Do you have a language of religion or a definition of religion that you offer?
Like, if you say to yourself, not everyone who says they're religious is religious, and not everyone who says they're not religious isn't religious, then what are we describing? Some kind of
That's a great point.
An awful lot of forms, some kind of personal and shared activity, but what's that activity trying to or actually producing?
Yeah.
What I toy with is a notion that there's the possibility for the harmonization of systems to produce a kind of gestalt excess that we can then enter into a relationship with through various interpretations. And then if we do that among like our inner subsystems, you get a phenomenon more like spirituality. And if we do it between types of people and between genres of human social experience, you get a phenomenon more like religion. And that it's probably necessary to do that, to have a robust, non-self-destructive society.
Yeah. No, I like that quite a bit. The internal spiritual dimension and the more external cultural, societal, religious dimension. I think those are both part and parcel of one another, certainly. And of course, religions they're not all the same, right? So we don't like to reduce them all to one thing necessarily, but there's different diagnostic ways of entering into the world as to what the problem is, what is wrong, as it were. And then how best do we go about fixing that? And I think it's on that question that you can't just, when I think of my own religious upbringing, I can't just stay within the realm of a single religion, because there's not just one thing that's wrong, right? There's multiple layers of illusion, of sin, of all sorts of things that religions are pointing to. And again, the element of prescriptive practice as a means of overcoming these darker sort of dimensions, I think that's essential to religion as well, recognizing something wrong, working towards overcoming it. And so there's an element of goal involved, right? You're using this language of harmony again, of value. There's something at stake in the nature of things, and we're a part of it. I think this is a deep religious subtext here. So
this is here's what just popped up for me. I'm thinking of Whitehead's really interesting way of pushing subjectivity all the way down the stack by thinking of things like prehension and these very primitive notions. How far down the stack does something like faith go? Is faith older than humanity?
Oh, cool. That's a good book title. Just have a question. Is faith older than humanity? I think it depends how you understand faith. Value is older than humanity, right? So we'd say that perhaps about value, perhaps about other things. But do subjective dimensions, again, the most fundamental element for Whitehead being a subjective event, it's something for itself. It becomes into being. Does it have an element of faith? I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Faith is older than humanity, certainly. I mean, we've the scheme of things, as we all know, we're very young. I think there's a way of thinking about that, but we'd have to define what we understand by faith.
I've got a similar question would be like, well, it's not necessarily similar in form, but it's similar in terms of what it's looking at. Do you have a function in a greater ecology? Like, does deep and up-to-date theology tell us anything about an evolved or adaptive or even ontological role that human beings ought to normatively play as part of a system, and therefore whose service to whatever we're part of is useful objectively rather than merely socially? Is there something we're supposed to be doing to serve a role in the system we're a part of?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. Something we're supposed to be doing. Yeah, it's tough to approach. I mean, clearly we're drawn out from nature in a kind of uniqueness. You don't necessarily see buffaloes doing philosophy, although, I wouldn't want to say too much about what the non-human animal world can do, because we're, again, a part of that lineage and that strain. But something unique has happened in us. And I think that uniqueness comes with responsibility, comes with obligation. And we're trying to figure that out. We're trying to figure out what is required of us. I think of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said religion is simply the consciousness of that something is required of you. Some obligation in the nature of things. So I think the challenge is for us to utilize our capacities to symbiotically reintegrate ourselves, because we have been abstracted and bifurcated from the natural world. Even in just our daily activities, I'm not sitting outside right now, I'm sitting inside. Looks like you are too, and practically I tell people, when was the last time you jumped in the ocean? Do it, just do it and see what happens, and then there's a lot of interesting tests that go out to say that we become more integrated, better human beings when we spend more time in the natural world. That's not just a trivial sort of thing. So I think the experiment is undergoing its process, and we're trying to develop theoretical schemes that help us symbiotically reintegrate ourselves. And I don't know if we've achieved that, but we're trying to. I think Whitehead's thought helps. I think various forms of ancient wisdom help. And I think it's a cumulative endeavor where we're not just going to be looking to one discipline, right? The sciences sort of help as well. But we have to be, I think, always careful to not just abstract ourselves from nature. We are part of nature for better or worse. And I don't think we should ever lose sight of that. I think once we lose sight of that, horrible things happen at various dimensions from various disciplines. I don't know if that helps. You can see I'm struggling with trying to answer that question.
I almost can't tell if it helps or not. I feel like it's a question at the edge of what's possible to be thought.
Yeah.
Like your notion of jumping in the ocean, it reminds me of a lot of neurochemical information we have now about the role of sunlight in regulating sleep cycles, and our whole relationship to the elementals has been. I do a lot of sort of neo-shamanic thinking and experimenting.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stands out to me is the tendency to treat the forces symbolically rather than experientially. So we go, well, what is it that fire and water represented? You're like, well, no, just go and be fire and go and get in the water is what it was indicating.
Yeah, it's much more literal. This is not symbolic. Well, it's both. I mean, that's the interesting thing is that, again, speaking to human uniqueness, at least in part, I want to be careful talking about that. The rise of symbolic thought. I mean, that's an incredible thing. It should not displace jumping in, in the ocean. Hopefully not the fire, but maybe that too. That's a part of our history. So I think that's an important point.
Do you think there's something on the far side of symbolic thought?
I think symbolic thought symbolizes something, or at least intends to. Right? If we just speak about things as symbols, it's like symbols of what? Mm-hmm. And there's a pointer, right? There's a sort of signified in a symbol, symbolified in some way. I think there is something on the far side, but precisely the language of symbolism is used because we can't quite capture what that is. There's something apophatic. There's something evading on a horizon. You move closer and it evades further. Use the language of symbolism to try to capture that. But of course, symbolism is also about communicating deeper truths. There's some truths that are so deep you can't speak to them literally, and therefore you have to use symbolism. This is a part of the religious tradition as well. What's being said in the Genesis narrative. To just say it's literal, historical, you're actually detracting from the depth of the truth that's involved. Just to speak from my context. So symbols, I think that they can't just be, symbols are abstractions from what they point to, even if they point to them imperfectly and vaguely. Might be one way to put it.
I'm thinking about the description you gave. I mean, you're basically doing the same structural move that you describe Whitehead as doing with God and the world when you describe humanity and nature as essentially being independently non-separable.
Yeah.
Seems to me there's a real role for the aesthetic value in that, right? I think like when nature subdivides into humanity and nature, then the possibility between them is that they could negotiate a set of configurations of nature that are of higher value to both humanity and nature. Like, because when we say natural, we don't mean like not all of nature is natural. Some of it's really messed up and unpleasant as far as we can tell. So there might be a sweet spot where, like the gardener sweet spot, that we negotiate with nature to produce an upgrade of nature that would be good for it and for ourselves, but which we recognize through some deep aesthetic instinct.
Absolutely. Again, the element of aesthetic value rising to the top again. I try to remind myself that my relationship to the world is literally the world's relationship to itself. Literally, because I'm not other than the world. I mean, in terms of thought, we can abstract our thought and be other in that sense. But I think it's a beautiful, beautiful vision once you see that we have essentially grown out of the universe as a plant does out of soil, and that we're connected to the soil of the universe in whatever dimensions, divine or otherwise, are a part of that. But it does, again, to use the language of something being required of us, it does implicate us in working towards not seeing ourselves as ultimately separate. And I just think to reintegrate ourselves, the element of aesthetic value has to be there. It's this element of cooperative harmony. Even Hartshorne talks about the laws of nature being achievements of aesthetic value. Why? Because harmony and intensity are concepts that are presupposed by them. Those are aesthetic concepts. I think that applies all the way up and down. We're just trying to work out what that would look like individually for our human lives and our relationships. I think we have to start there, and then from there we move outward to the wider world. And I do think I'm a fan and an advocate of trying to make the best of each moment, even though I don't always do that. Whether you're in a coffee shop or elsewhere, people neglect to realize very small adjustments to their life have such a huge impact. And there's an ethics of interconnection in all this too, because we know that we're not ultimately separate. We're utterly connected with everything. And small things go a very long way, whether with human interaction, the moral interaction, and also interactions with the non-human sort of world, right? So there's an element of spiritual depth to all that I think haunts me, that haunts a lot of people, rightly so.
Who do you think is doing good contemporary or recent work in philosophy and or theology? Who do you like?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I mentioned Ian McGilchrist. I'm a big fan of Ian's work. I would personally say I think he's a process philosopher of a high grade. He's influenced by Whitehead's thought, but certainly not just Whitehead, Schelling, others, William James, and also deep dimensions of indigenous wisdom traditions, ancient traditions. So I think I'm a huge fan of his. I think he is an incredible ally and perhaps one of the most significant scholarly voices since Whitehead in many ways. His research is, I think, pretty incredible. So I'm still navigating his insights. I hope to get him on a podcast eventually. You guys would have a great conversation. You should consider doing that if you haven't already. So I would point to his work. I've also been enjoying the various conversations with Bernardo Castro. Perhaps you're familiar with Bernardo's work. I think he's a curious and interesting philosophical mind, original in a lot of ways, and I've been sort of chewing on some of his material. I think those who have a certain trajectory, Matt Siegel, you may know, who's in the Whiteheadian world as well. I really appreciate his work, his contributions. Of course, he's at the California School for Integral Studies in San Francisco. And in terms of a more mystical, interreligious side, I point to the work of Roland Faber, who I mentioned as well, who I think is one of the most creative, I think, philosophical and theological minds today. And I'd recommend two of his books. One would be God as Poet of the World, for those who are looking for a deep dive into process thinking that's history, but also The Garden of Reality, Trans-Religious Relativity in a World of Becoming, is his recent work integrating Baha'i scholarship, Baha'i thought, Whitehead, as well as The Divine Manifold, which looks at a lot of post-structuralist thinking and Whitehead's thought too. So, I mean, there's a lot to name, but those are just a few. And as you know, it's a chaos of reading, and that's just a part of the fun. It's a wild ride, I'd say.
Yeah, I know Matt, and I've talked to him on the show several times. He's doing some
good,
really interesting thinking.
Yeah, I was recently with Matt up in Oregon. The Center for Process Studies, where I work, recently did a conference titled Astrobiology, Exophilosophy, and Cosmic Religion. And we brought people from NASA and various religious and philosophical voices together to look at process thinking, the relevance of process style thinking for these questions of life beyond Earth and the impact of discovery, which I think is even more interesting given the recent photos from the Webb telescope. Pretty nerdy stuff, I'd say.
What have you changed your mind about in the last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've become more pessimistic. I think a lot of folks can say that. I've been more pessimistic about human beings in a deep way. It wasn't, again, I don't want to say that I was naively optimistic before. I'm still optimistic because I think there's a place for value and novelty and possibility that is injecting into the world at each moment. I've become much more of a political critic in a way I wasn't previously. And that goes for both sides of this dysfunctional spectrum. You know, Whitehead was against metaphysical bifurcation, right? Mind, don't ultimately tear apart mind and matter, as it were. I think there's an element of political bifurcation that we have to combat against for our own sake. So I've become, in the COVID era and a lot of this tumultuous social era, much more of a political critic. And I've sought to, I think, look for philosophical resources to navigate some of these ridiculous times that we're witnessing. My ideas on philosophy and religion, my ideas on God are always open to changing. I don't think they've altered too much in the last few years, but they've been deepened as I continue to read more, as I continue to think and teach and write on these issues. And I don't know if there's any one, I think, perspective or domain of thought which has altered in a drastic way. But in principle, I have to be open to that. That's part of the philosophical journey And I would hope to try to be humble about that, because the last thing I want to be is a dogmatic person. So it's an open and unfolding sort of process. Would you point to something that's changed immediately for you? I mean, is it obvious that something rises? It's a hard question. I mean, I point to the political because it's the most obvious for me.
I think like my sense of the apocalyptic nature of the mid-range time period has certainly increased in the last couple of years, and my sense that preparing for destabilization is a much more serious thing than I'd previously given credit for.
You're stocking up food, huh?
Well, because you don't know which destabilization is coming. It's not going to help.
Right.
Prepare in a lot of different directions a little bit. Most of the people I know who are preppers have a very narrow idea of what they might be preparing for. I think I've changed my mind on the plausibility of the multiverse, over the last 5 or 6 years. It seemed
interesting. How so? Just
I previously
it's becoming more implausible for you.
It became more plausible.
Okay,
I'd sort of, you grow up with it as the background, multiple timelines scenario of all the culture we have, if you like science fiction, especially. But I felt it was just too much. Where do you put all that? But it was, I think, watching an old video with David Deutsch, does quantum computation, has an interesting new theory called constructor theory. But he was, showing how the single photon or the single electron interferes with itself. And, in the simplest possible experiment, he said, isn't the simplest possible assumption is that there's more than one of them? If one of them behaves like there's more than one of them, shouldn't we assume there's actually more than one of them? And I was like, that's very interesting. That's a very basic kind of first principles approach. And it started to open me up to, there could be like the physical reality of side universes is now something that I'm willing to accept. Not necessarily that it is true, but I don't emotionally reject it the way I used to.
Got it. Well, what was originally your reason for rejecting?
I think I disliked first of all, that there was seemingly no way to access any of it. And my intuition was that everything should be integrated somehow, right?
Yeah.
That really, whatever all that, but I think I was mistaking the degree to which a multiverse implies multiple realities. Really, we're talking about one self-consistent reality, even though it's open, it just has different narrative trajectories through itself. I was probably exaggerating the dichotomy.
Yeah. I hear you there. Yeah, it's a struggle. I think, again, it's based on sort of how we understand what a universe is. If it's the totality of all things, then it would seem there has to be one, as it were. But even to say there's one doesn't mean there's not utter multiplicities, right? And
it opens up really interesting questions like, are there lots of possibilities and one of them becomes actual? Or are there a lot of actualities and we just point to those as possibles?
Well, right. And I sense in that a little pointer, you might know David Lewis's work, right, which is quite fascinating, where he's essentially collapsing the distinction between the possible and the actual. The possible is merely what we think about what could be from our perspective, but literally everything we can think in terms of what can be is, but not in our perspective, right? But I do think it's to say that everything is actual somewhere, the form of any and all possible worlds, raises a terrible question of value too. There are literally hellish worlds, inconceivably hellish worlds that on that proposal would have to be. And I think affirming, as I think you do, this element of value being ontologically real or basic, that means there's a filter involved in some way, right? In principle, if that's true, whatever universe the divine pursues is ones that are worth pursuing, the ones that have some preponderance of value to it, and again, value justifying being, again, this is again what I've written on quite a bit, but so I think there's an axiological argument against the idea of every possibility being actual just somewhere else. But I should say, just on the topic of the multiverse as well, there's different people in different camps in the process world. Whitehead seems to think that there are a succession of cosmic epochs, and that ours is one and will be followed by another. Perhaps it begins with the Big Bang. He wrote prior to Big Bang cosmology. And yet others like Roland Faber, and I'd recommend Layman McHenry as well. The Event University has a great chapter on current multiverse hypothesis, where he's bringing Whitehead's thought into. So I think there's both camps, for and against. And I think adding the discussion of the theological element to this is also a complication, because often on a more, I think, narrow surface level discussion, the multiverse is an option that doesn't include God, right? It's a way of making sense of what seems to be very quote unquote fine-tuned or limited dimensions allowing us to be here. And I think that's a sort of interesting part. I'd recommend also my recent book, Process Cosmology, edited volume, has some good work on plurality of worlds in terms of Whitehead's thinking as well. But yeah, super fascinating discussion. I totally agree. We don't have access to it, which means it's not a purely scientific, as it were, hypothesis. It's much more philosophical and metaphysical. So I think that is also part of misunderstanding. Right?
Turn out that we do have access to it in a way that we have not been understanding to have been accessed. There's a great Neil Stephenson has this novel Anthem, and one of the protagonists toward the end is proposing this idea that we've evolved a consciousness that doesn't run multiple scenarios, but it actually just accesses other actual scenarios, and that what we call consciousness has always been a sort of sorting and integration, so that it's evolutionarily more efficient to grab information in some way. So that's obviously fantastical and speculative, but it points to the idea that there could be some form of access that we haven't identified as such. We treat it as a normal part of existence in this universe, but all these areas are completely speculative.
Totally. But I think that, absolutely, and that could be true. But man, where would we be without the speculative? We need that imaginative dimension. Yeah. Whitehead has this famous metaphor of an airplane taking off in the first couple pages of Process and Reality, right? It starts from the ground of concrete experience, takes off into the realms of imaginative generalization, speculation, which are necessarily a part of it, and lands again to test itself with the data of experience. It's a wonderful sort of imaginative aeronautical metaphor for philosophizing. And he didn't necessarily speak of metaphysics per se, but speculative philosophy. But it's not purely speculative, because it emerges from our experiential base. So yeah, the verdict's out on the multiverse thing. I think things are only going to get more interesting. Again, to mention the Webb telescope, the astrobiological interest, I think that world is quite fascinating. Different data being released from the government, who knows about that, but also interesting. It's endless.
Yeah. Well, I'm out of questions. This could be the end, or maybe you have something else we should talk about.
Maybe it's the beginning. No, I appreciate talking with you. I can tell you're an adventurous spirit, an adventurous mind, and I'm glad we were able to connect it and take it to some interesting directions, I think. So I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, this has been great, Andrew. I'd love to have further conversation with you. You seem sharp and open and coherent, and also smiley, and
well, yes. Well, I'll take that. Thanks a lot.
All right. Cheers, man. Good talking with you.
You as well.